floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor and fellow panelists and their organizers. It's been a wonderful time the last 3 days. So my paper with the slightly changed title now. I'm looking at the politics of peace processes in Afghanistan, and specifically looking at this one case study, a bit of an exceptional situation where a peace process actually resulted in a peace agreement that was then, broadly speaking, implemented, and the ceasefire and other arrangements within it were more or less honored by the belligerent parties. And there is a purpose behind this endeavor, and that I feel like there are lessons to be learned, as the professor kind of implied. Things that we can observe and theorize and think about that might be instructive for the current predicament of Afghanistan. Just want to make sure all the time. Right. So just a bit of a context. Afghanistan, over 4 decades of armed conflict, as you probably are aware of, despite what image that might invoke, there has always been attempts at a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Peace processes have more or less always paralleled military confrontation. On 3 separate occasions, these peace processes actually led to peace agreements that were implemented, but at the same time, peace agreements that did not quite respond to the needs of Afghan people, and as such establish or manage to deliver a lasting and just peace. And there is one reason for why that is. Each of these agreements, and I've gone on to list them, the 88 Geneva Accords, the 5 December, there should be a 2001 there, Bonn Agreement, and then the 2020 Doha Agreement. They have one quite bizarre feature that they hold in common. They exclude rather willingly one side to the conflict from the terms of the agreements themselves. So in 88, the militant Islamists were not a party to the agreement. Instead, Afghanistan and Pakistan signed the agreements with the guarantors, as you can see there, Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan, supporting each of their satellite states. In 2001, the newly defeated, villainized at the time, perhaps you can build a case that quite rightly so, but the Taliban were excluded from the peace agreement, for which both the Afghan people and the international community paid dearly. And now we know that there were some attempts at overtures from their side. In 2020, as crazy as this might sound, the Afghan government were excluded. So it was an agreement between the Americans and the Taliban. And I guess the 2016 agreement, which is the 4th one, is rather unique in the modern, in the history of conflict in Afghanistan, because it did not necessarily exclude any of the belligerent parties on the one hand. On the other hand, it didn't have a direct involvement of international actors per se. It had to work with and through the constraints and opportunities provided by them. And so the agreement was between Hezb-i-Islami Afghanistan, which is an old political party, an Islamist faction supported by the West in its heyday in the 80s to fight the Soviet Union. And then by the 90s, kind of towards the late 90s, kind of lost its hold on power, was sidelined. But by 2001, when the West came back to Afghanistan, it kind of re-entered the scene. The Hezb-i-Islami of Hekmatyar is the leader of it, and the Afghan government. Now, in the paper, I've gone on to talk more about what's so unique about Hezb-i-Islami and the pantheon of Afghan political actors, or political sort of context. I won't bore you too much with that stuff now. But so just a little bit in terms of theorizing what I'm trying to, the case that I'm trying to build in here. So the case of, in the context of Afghanistan, power its articulation in many ways could rather easily be construed or presented as coloniality of power. It's not just any power, it's colonialism continuing to embed itself in power arrangement and institutions, and very much define the encounters of Afghans with the outside world. Now, coloniality of power, as Annabelle Quayano would tell us, has a couple of qualities, as does colonialism proper in its heyday as well. But prime amongst it is this demand for assimilation, this desire to erase alterity, this sort of rather forceful attempt at marginalizing other alternative modes of thinking, knowledge perspectives, cosmologies, worldviews, so on and so forth. In Afghanistan after 2001, any talk of peace, any talk of a diplomatic resolution to the conflict would be articulated through the liberal peace worldview or perspective. And that had some contradictions, one of them being that with the signing of this important foundational document, the 2001 Bonn Agreement, there was this claim, rather against a lot of evidence, that Afghanistan lived in a post-conflict society, so we should just deal with it as such, even though there was a war going on, and there was a war going on for 20 years. But we also know that the Afghans themselves, the local allies, illiberal allies to the Western intervention, peace building, state building, and war on terror projects, from different post-colonial, decolonial literature, we know that the local native allies to colonial powers, they occupied this complex place or site of subjecthood, in that they might say one thing but mean something else. They might, articulate or utter their priorities in certain terms, but then in action things could look different. There's a certain performativity to it all, as Frantz Fanon would like to remind us. But there's also some good literature on this stuff. So the categories or the sort of representations of Afghan allies and actors from a Western liberal perspective over the last 20 years of war on terror and state building, it's not really as stable, because at their core, they're representations. We like to project a certain image, sort of the American Western resourceful outsider would like to project a certain image, but those representations aren't that stable, and we can see it time and again in different examples of key political actors. Another literature here coming from constructivist IR traditions that's quite helpful is, this notion of sovereignty in externally governed spaces, and how it could be compromised, and how from within these sites and spaces, there's kind of a certain potential and at times will to resist and push back and promote alternative projects. So look, there's many ways we can go about this, and in the paper I go on and on talking about it. But here, just that there are alternative visions and perspectives on what peace is, which Cruz has captured in pluriversal or decolonial peace. And I think this language could be instructive to explain what happened in 2016, but also going into the future. Now, a couple of challenges in terms of, so it wasn't easy to agree to bring the different belligerent parties to an agreement. 2016 agreement took a lot of effort, and the actors had to be committed to overcome a number of deeply embedded cultural, structural challenges. For one, the Americans, after the Obama surge of 2008, 2009, even though they agreed that they would withdraw their troops by 2014, so there was a hard timeline. But at the same time, so that means there should be a need for support for peace process. But they wouldn't quite go all the way. They would say, we believe in reintegration. So the fighters, put down your weapons. We will reward you for that type of cooperation, but no reconciliation. Right? And there's a politics to it all. Reconciliation means that your views and grievances might be legitimate, whereas reintegration is essentially, in a way, put down the arms. It's a form of co-optation and appeasement, right? So the Afghans negotiating or facilitating this peace process had to work with that. And it wasn't easy from talking to them and hearing their perspectives and memories of that period. The other thing is that the Hezb, this militant faction, had all types of enmities within political parties and factions and fronts in the country that had all of a sudden been empowered and enabled, and because they were allies to the Western liberal regime or project. So how do you deal with that? And it wasn't just as simple as we have a history. The shape and cityscapes, for example, in Afghanistan, they had now changed. We were lionizing certain figures. There was a certain national narrative that had been internalized within the state and to some extent within the society. There's that photo that's from where I grew up, very close to me. It was a different square, this one in the bottom. It was called the Ministry of Public Health Square when I was growing up. But in 2002, they came and they renamed it. This is square of the national hero, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud was the very much had a rivalry that went back to the 70s with Hekmatyar, right? But then on the other hand, the Hezb-i-Islami, in many ways, I suppose their understanding of power also evolved and grew. They believed a lot more since 2003, 2004 in the power of information, misinformation, disinformation, PR campaigns, putting together counter histories and counter narratives, right? And so by 2017, there was a claim that Hekmatyar, the leader of this Islamist faction, had written 118 books. Right, and so that's just one example of it there. It's called, I read it for this paper a little closely, but I've been reading this guy's work for years now. It's called Dasais Penhan Chehrahay Uryan, hidden or concealed conspiracies, naked faces. Something like that. And so in it, you read the book and he's just going after everybody. But those people are now in Kabul, they're in power, and you have to make peace with them. So very difficult, but there are also opportunities. The facilitators, the High Peace Council of Afghanistan, for one, they were, I think, in many ways, oscillating between pragmatism and a more principled approach. So when it came to pragmatism, you go to talk to Americans to lift the sanctions regimes. You promise them that this peace agreement will help with the implementation of the liberal project. Right? You also promise them that this will actually help with bringing Taliban to the peace talks, which is really the main enemy, right? That's the more existential threat. When you go and talk to the enemies or the rivals of Hezb within the current state, you tell them if there is a confrontation down the line with the Taliban, you want these guys on your side, not on their side, right? And again, similar promises. And in the paper, I go on to explain a couple of other things as well. But, when the Afghans are in the driver's seat, things look very different. When peace is looked at from this decentered, pluriversal kind of perspective, things look a lot more different. We have more tools that are attuned to the local conditions of Afghanistan, its geohistorical locatedness. And that seems to have gone a long way towards securing what I'll show you next, that peace agreement. And now that's an annotated draft of the agreement. They shared it with me, some context, but it's interesting to see what they were going back and forth about. And those handwritings are of the president at the time of Afghanistan on the margins of the draft of the agreement. But it's very interesting. And in the paper, I go on to read very closely what the agreement was actually all about. So it's really some solid concessions from the Afghan government. And to their credit, they managed to deliver on a lot of that. But when it comes to the demands from the militant faction who had been fighting the regime and fighting the Western troops for 16 years at that point, release the prisoners, respect and come to our side by respecting and acknowledging the legality of the 2004 Constitution. And in the meantime, let go of this insistence on foreign troops withdrawal from the country. But the one issue that seems to be more important than anything else is work with us side by side to cut some type of a peace deal with the Taliban. Right. So, and then the other two documents are certain decrees by the president that it essentially implements the peace agreement. Just to conclude, we have to rethink peace, and we have to rethink it from the perspective of global South, especially if we are to deliver peace in locales in the global South. Peace is not there's no fixed sort of silver bullet that can deliver us peace in these contexts. Rather, peace and the processes involved, they're contested, they're plural, they are inherently political projects. But also, and this is very much a core principle of decolonial thinking, tension is something that we should be in political processes and entanglements and encounters. Tension is something that we have to be at peace with, I suppose. That we shouldn't always try to resolve difference, but that we can coexist. Different worlds, different perspectives, different epistemological frameworks can coexist. The binaries, especially the liberal binaries after the 1990s sort of post-Cold War self-congratulatory moment, and these binaries, the way that they would crystallize. So state, non-state actor, peace, violence, legitimate, illegitimate actors. You don't always need to have a clear-cut, predefined understanding of what these are. There is reprieve, there's promise, intention. And I think the Afghans, in their own way, limited as they were by the imposition of certain institutionalized liberal sensibilities, they kind of delivered on that. The 2016 peace agreement and peace process succeeded because it was not exclusively imitating a Western model. And indeed, that had failed anyways. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much.